The portion of God's Word on which we'll focus our hearts this evening comes from Luke chapter 23, verses 26 through 34. It's printed on pages 8 and 9 in the worship folder if you'd like to follow along as I read it. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The word of our God. Let's begin with prayer. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always pleasing in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today, only 2/3 of Americans would say that they're Christians. That number is down from 3/4 of Americans just a decade ago. At that current rate of decline, it'll probably only be about one generation until Christianity becomes a minority religion in our country. And our youth are already nearly a minority among their peers. And that 1/3 of the population that isn't Christian, it's not like they have a really positive view and mindset about Christians. Surveys and studies have found that non-Christians would describe Christians more likely with words like hateful, judgmental, bigoted, misogynistic, and racist than they would kind and caring and generous. And those are just the stats. What about the stories? Students mocked and ridiculed by their teachers in front of all of their classmates for believing that God made the world. People losing their jobs because they refused to practice immoral or unethical business in their company. People shunned and separated and mocked by their friends by simply practicing their Christian faith. Not even to mention the funny looks and the biting comments and the cold shoulders that Christians often receive from unbelievers on a regular basis. We poor Christians. Should we look for sympathy? We won't find it from the world. In fact, many of them are very excited about the fact that Christianity is losing its influence in our society, that Christians are being finally put back in their place. We poor Christians. Should we say that? Maybe more importantly for our discussion tonight, would Jesus say that? And certainly Jesus, in our sermon text for tonight, makes a very sympathetic figure as he's led out to Golgotha, the place of the skull, to be crucified. Maybe a better word, though, than a sympathetic figure is a pathetic figure. His back is shredded from the scourging. His face and his body are black and blue and purple from the repeated beatings. Blood is running down his head and his face from the thorns jammed into his scalp and his skull. After a night without sleep, without food, without drink, after exhaustion and loss of blood, Jesus' weakened body simply crumbles under the weight of the cross, forcing the soldiers to pick someone else out of the crowd who could carry it for him. It's no wonder that the women mourned and wailed as they followed behind. And we don't know exactly whether these women, these people that were following Jesus as he carried the cross, are these disciples, are these his followers, his believers, or are they just simply curious citizens that got caught up in the crowd? But in either situation, these women see a man, a fellow human being, treated so brutally, so heartlessly, that they can't help but break down into tears. So what does Jesus say? Does he say, "Woe is me, have pity on me, show sympathy to me because of what I'm suffering"? No, he says the opposite. Jesus says to those mourning women, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' They will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.'" Jesus says, don't feel sympathetic towards me. Have pity for yourselves. In fact, 5 days before this, Jesus himself wept for Jerusalem. Because he knew that because they rejected him as the Messiah, they were going to have to face God's wrath and God's judgment on them for their lack of trust. And history records the horrific acts that took place to mothers and children and citizens when the Romans captured and destroyed the city of Jerusalem just one generation later. Things so horrific that mothers wished they were childless so they didn't have to see their children suffer. That citizens would rather have the mountains fall on them and crush them to death rather than to starve and be tortured and captured by their enemies. Jesus gave them a proverbial warning with these words. If people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? Jesus seems to be saying to them that if he, the perfectly innocent Son of God, was going to be forced to suffer and die even though he had done nothing wrong, then should the sinful Israelites be surprised when they would suffer and die for their rejection of the one true God? And maybe there's something in that for us too. Should it be, if the innocent, perfect Son of God is persecuted and put on trial and forced to suffer for who he was, should we as Christians really be surprised when we also are persecuted and put on trial and forced to suffer because of who it is that we follow? As Jesus himself told his followers, if the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. You see, when we hear about the decline of Christianity in our country, and we see our society moving further away from biblical morality and godly values, when we feel the sting of rejection and mockery for our faith, it is very easy for us to think of ourselves as these helpless victims that certainly deserve everyone's sympathy. To have a woe is me attitude. But if we have that woe is me attitude, it reveals a couple of different problems of perspective that we maybe have. For example, if you look at the big picture, the things that we as Christians in America suffer today compared to what Christians have been suffering all over the world over the course of the ages since the Christian church began, ours isn't all that bad. Generations of approval and acceptance and comfort for Christianity in America is certainly not the norm. It's the outlier when you look at the history of the world. So what we're experiencing is not abnormal. In fact, it's probably less normal than typical throughout history. And if we have this woe is us mentality, it ends up making us very sinfully self-centered. See, if we're focusing on this woe is me mentality about the things that we suffer in this world, what it leads us to do is to complain and grumble and whine that God's not doing anything about it. It makes us to lash out against those who disagree or who mock us. It leads us to give up hope It leads us to wonder and question. It leads us to lean our hopes and our trust on flawed, sinful people and governments and systems to get back what we think we've lost. But when did God ever tell us to play the victim? That's certainly not what we see from Jesus in this text, is it? Self-pity is the exact opposite of what Jesus does here. Instead of self-pity, he has pity for those women and for their children and for their husbands and for their fellow Israelites. And it doesn't stop there. If we follow Jesus' stumbling steps all the way to the cross, where he was lifted up like a common criminal, we hear the first words that he speaks from that cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. He shows sympathy and asks God to forgive those who are pounding nails into his hands and his feet. Jesus' words reveal his heart, don't they? His heart that was not at all focused on himself in that moment, but was entirely focused on all the other people around him. His heart was thinking about those Israelites. He was thinking about those Roman soldiers who had no clue that they were crucifying the very Son of God. His heart was thinking about us. See, if Jesus had pitied himself for the unjust treatment that he was receiving on that day, he very easily could have put a stop to it right away. But instead, Jesus had pity on us. On wretched sinners like us who had an eternal destruction coming that was going to be far worse than anything that the Romans could have done. He has pity and he shows sympathy towards us because he knew that we deserve to face God's wrath on the last day, and there's going to be no mountain that could cover us and hide us from it. Jesus has sympathy for us. Embed that thought into your hearts and your minds, friends, in Christ. Jesus' heart went out to you. But he doesn't just weep and wail for you like those women did, helpless that they were. In his sympathy and his love, he takes the punishment that we deserve on himself. It's his blood that is shed for us, that covers us and hides us from the pending wrath and judgment that is to come. He died for you. Because through the pain, through the exhaustion, through the ridicule, Jesus had you on his heart. Now, to say that Jesus didn't want their sympathy doesn't mean that he didn't deserve their sympathy. See, there's a reason that those women were so moved to mourn and wail just at the sight of Jesus, so brutalized and beaten. A man who should have been in peak physical condition, unable even to bear and carry a beam of wood, shows us everything that Jesus was willing to suffer leading up to that point, and his torments had only begun at that point. And if God tells us that he doesn't want us to just seek out pity and sympathy for ourselves when we bear our crosses, it doesn't mean that God doesn't care. It doesn't mean that God doesn't still pity us and have sympathy for us, because he knows our weaknesses and he knows our pain, because right here we see that he experienced it himself. His sympathy endures for us. His heart goes out for us when we suffer, especially when we suffer for his name. But Jesus doesn't want us to wallow in self-pity. He doesn't want us to put our heads in the sand in our self-pity. Instead, he wants us to look past ourselves. He wants us to look to him. He wants us to look to him who so empowers and equips us through word and sacrament that we can bear the heavy crosses that we as Christians have to bear in this life. He wants us to look past ourselves and to focus with sympathy on all those around us in our lives. Because there are fellow Christians out there experiencing pain and temptation. There are fellow believers just like us who feel the attacks of the forces of evil in this world, and they feel so very much alone. And so in Jesus' love and sympathy, he wants us to look in sympathy to them, to love them, to care for their needs, to pray for them, to be there for them in those hopes, or those hurts and those fears with the hope of the promises that God has made to them. And just like Jesus was willing to do on the cross, Jesus also wants us to look out with sympathy to our enemies, even to those who make our lives harder and our crosses heavier. Jesus wants us to look with sympathy on them as well. Because there is a destruction coming that this world cannot fathom. A destruction that so many people either don't realize is coming or they don't want to realize is coming. See, like the soldiers that nailed Jesus to the cross, so many people, they don't know what they're doing. They think that they're just simply fighting old-fashioned fairy tales, or that they're fighting back against outdated values, that they're fighting to give everyone the freedom to live their lives however they choose. But what they don't realize is that they're fighting against God, and just how much of a losing battle that's destined to be. So what if, instead of seeing those people as heartless enemies that we need to destroy, or as obstacles that we need to avoid, what if instead we saw them as fellow sinners who also have been duped by Satan's lies into carrying out his will, just like we so often are duped by Satan's lies into carrying out his will? What if instead of hating them, we love them, we pray for them, we warn them in a loving way, we share the truth with them, we tell them about the forgiveness and the salvation that is also theirs through Jesus Christ? What if, instead of pointing the finger at them as the cause of all of our problems, we instead point the finger to Jesus as the solution to all of their problems? What if? In other words, instead of begging for sympathy when we struggle, let's save our sympathy for others. Would Jesus say, poor Christians? We already know the answer. Because about 3 years before his crucifixion, he preached in his Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Not poor Christians, but blessed Christians. For yours is the kingdom of heaven. And so when this world treats you like they treated him, instead of begging for sympathy or playing the victim, instead, know that because of him who looked in mercy and pity and sympathy not to his own needs, but to your needs and the needs of the whole world, you're not a victim. You're a victor through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.